The luxurious Lumiere Café was buzzing with quiet conversations and the clinking of fine china when Keanu Reeves walked in, his understated presence catching no immediate attention. But when a waiter laughed at his simple order of tea, not knowing who he was, the entire café was about to witness a moment they'd never forget. The café was a haven for the city's elite. Glistening chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their golden light reflecting off marble floors. Designer handbags rested casually on chairs, and conversations floated through the air, peppered with talk of weekend getaways and high-profile deals. Everything about Lumiere Café screamed exclusivity. Keanu Reeves walked in with a quiet demeanor, dressed in a simple black jacket, well-worn jeans, and boots that had clearly seen their fair share of city streets. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't need to be. For him, this was just a moment to enjoy a peaceful cup of tea in a bustling city. He approached the counter and scanned the elaborate menu, filled with items that sounded more like works of art than beverages. A young waiter, no older than 25, stepped up to take his order. The waiter, dressed impeccably in the cafe's signature uniform, exuded a practiced politeness that barely concealed his judgment. "What can I get for you today, sir?" the waiter asked, his tone smooth but distant. Keanu smiled lightly. "A cup of tea, please." The waiter blinked, his polite mask faltering. "Tea?" he repeated, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Just tea?" "Yes, just tea," Keanu replied calmly, completely unfazed by the waiter's reaction. The waiter's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "Of course, sir, but you do know we specialize in rare blends. It's not exactly a typical order." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his smile unwavering. "I'm sure it'll be great." As the waiter turned to prepare the order, his carefully crafted professionalism gave way to an audible scoff. He muttered something under his breath, just loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. A few chuckles followed from a corner table, where two impeccably dressed men exchanged amused glances. Keanu noticed, but he didn't react. Instead, he casually slid his hands into his jacket pockets, waiting patiently as the tension around him began to simmer. The waiter returned with the tea, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he were carrying a priceless artifact. Placing the cup on the counter with an exaggerated flourish, he leaned in slightly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Here you go, sir. 1 cup of tea. It's a rare blend, as I mentioned, imported directly from the Himalayas. Quite the luxury." A few patrons nearby stifled laughter, their eyes darting between Keanu and the waiter like spectators at a theater. The waiter, emboldened by their reactions, continued his act. "I hope it meets your expectations," he added, his tone a blend of mockery and condescension. Keanu picked up the cup, nodding in quiet appreciation. "Thank you," he said, his calm tone almost disarming. He turned toward the seating area and chose a table near the large glass window, settling in with a serene expression. The whispers began almost immediately. "Did he really just order tea?" someone murmured. "Why even come here?" another scoffed. The waiter standing by the counter basked in the quiet mockery of the room. "I mean, what's next? Asking for a cup of instant coffee?" he quipped to a colleague, loud enough for others to hear. The cafe rippled with restrained chuckles, the air thick with judgment. Keanu sipped his tea, his posture relaxed, his gaze focused on the world outside the window. He was a stark contrast to the restless energy swirling around him, as if he existed on a different wavelength entirely. But while Keanu appeared unmoved, a young woman sitting at a nearby table watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of discomfort. Dressed in professional attire, she had initially joined in the quiet laughter, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that the waiter's behavior had crossed a line. As the waiter continued his theatrics, she leaned toward the person sitting with her. "Is it just me? Or does this feel unnecessary?" she whispered. The other patron hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, it's kind of over the top. The guy's just having tea." At his table, Keanu set his cup down gently, a faint smile playing on his lips. The growing murmur of the cafe suggested the room was shifting, even if the waiter hadn't noticed it yet. As the whispers grew quieter, a subtle shift began to ripple through the cafe. While some patrons still chuckled or exchanged knowing smirks, others started to reconsider their reactions. The young woman who had spoken up earlier glanced over at Keanu again, her curiosity piqued by his unbothered demeanor. Keanu, oblivious or perhaps deliberately indifferent to the murmurs, continued sipping his tea. The serene way he carried himself, unaffected by the snickers or snide comments, slowly began to cast a spell on the room. His calmness wasn't just unshaken, it was commanding. The waiter, however, was far from done. Seeing Keanu's lack of reaction as a challenge, he walked past his table, speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "You know, sir, most of our patrons order something a bit more refined. Perhaps you'd enjoy our signature soufflé. It pairs well with simplicity." A few scattered laughs followed, but they lacked the enthusiasm from earlier. Some patrons, like the young woman, now found the waiter's behavior grating rather than amusing. The mood was shifting, and the waiter didn't seem to notice. Keanu placed his cup down, looking up at the waiter with an easy smile. "That's kind of you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm perfectly content with the tea. It's simple, but it's excellent." The way he said it carried more weight than the words themselves. A couple at a nearby table exchanged a glance, their earlier smirks replaced by subtle frowns. The young woman, now visibly uncomfortable with the waiter's antics, leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she observed him. "What's his problem?" she muttered under her breath. Keanu, meanwhile, remained composed. His gaze shifted briefly to the window as he watched a child outside share a snack with a stray dog. The simple act seemed to bring him more joy than anything happening inside the cafe. The waiter's forced smile faltered slightly, and he moved away, finally sensing the diminishing support for his performance. As he walked back to the counter, a soft voice from the elderly man seated near the door broke the quiet. "He doesn't care what you think," the man said, his tone both amused and approving. Though he spoke softly, the words carried across the room like a challenge to everyone who had laughed. The elderly man's words seemed to hang in the air, shifting the cafe's energy even further. The waiter froze mid-step, glancing over his shoulder at the old man, who sipped his espresso with an air of calm defiance. Around the room, patrons who had joined in the earlier laughter now avoided eye contact, their unease palpable. Keanu turned slightly toward the elderly man, his lips curling into a faint smile of acknowledgement. Though he said nothing, the interaction carried an unspoken camaraderie, a shared understanding between two people who didn't need to explain themselves. The waiter, now visibly flustered, returned to the counter, busying himself with tasks that seemed suddenly trivial. The mockery had backfired, and the once amused audience had grown silent, their judgment replaced by quiet reflection. Keanu, still composed, finished his tea and carefully placed the cup back on its saucer. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and carried the empty cup to the counter himself. The waiter stiffened as Keanu approached, his earlier bravado now entirely gone. "Thank you," Keanu said, his tone polite and genuine. "It was excellent." The waiter blinked, caught off guard by the simple kindness in Keanu's words. You're welcome," he managed, his voice lacking the earlier arrogance. Keanu placed a bill on the counter, far more than the cost of the tea, and nodded. "Keep the change." The gesture wasn't loud or grand, but its simplicity carried weight. The young woman from earlier watched the exchange, her discomfort turning into admiration. She leaned toward her companion. "I don't think he's trying to prove anything. That's just who he is." As Keanu turned to leave, a voice called out from the back of the cafe. "Wait!" It was the young woman. She stood, her cheeks flushed, but her voice steady. "I'm sorry about earlier, for laughing. It wasn't right." Keanu paused, looking back at her with the same calm expression he had worn throughout. "It's all right," he said gently. "We all have moments. What matters is how we move forward." The young woman nodded, her gaze steady. Around the cafe, others exchanged glances, some nodding subtly in agreement. The waiter, still standing behind the counter, seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment, realizing just how much the tide had turned. The cafe was quiet now, the earlier murmurs and laughter replaced by an almost reverent silence. Keanu nodded politely at the young woman who had apologized, then turned toward the exit. The glass door swung open with a soft chime, and he stepped into the bustling world outside, disappearing into the crowd. Inside, the atmosphere remained heavy, as if the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. The waiter stood motionless behind the counter, his earlier smugness completely dissolved. He stared at the bill Keanu had left, a sum so generous it felt more like a lesson than a tip. The elderly man near the door chuckled softly, breaking the silence. "You know," he said, addressing no one in particular, "it's not every day you see someone handle themselves with that kind of grace." The young woman who had spoken earlier nodded. "It's rare," she said, her voice carrying a note of admiration. "He didn't lash out, didn't try to humiliate anyone. He just was." Her companion leaned in, his voice low. "Do you think he knows who that was?" he asked, jerking his chin toward the waiter. The young woman shook her head. "I don't think it matters to him." The waiter, overhearing their conversation, flushed deeply. He cleared his throat and began tidying the counter, though his movements were slow and distracted. The truth of their words stung more than he cared to admit. Near the window, the couple who had initially exchanged mocking glances now looked pensive. "We were wrong," the man said quietly to his partner. "About him, about all of it." His partner nodded, but said nothing. Instead, she sipped her coffee in silence, her gaze fixed on the empty chair where Keanu had been sitting moments before. The cafe began to stir back to life, but the mood was noticeably different. Conversations resumed, though they were quieter, less self-absorbed. Patrons exchanged glances that carried a sense of shared understanding, as if everyone in the room had silently agreed to be better, even in small ways. The young woman who had apologized earlier stood, collecting her things. As she passed the counter, she paused and looked at the waiter. "You know," she said gently, "you can turn this around. It's not too late." The waiter hesitated, her words catching him off guard. For a moment, he considered brushing her off, but the sincerity in her voice made him stop. "Thanks," he said quietly, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. "I'll think about it." The elderly man at the door watched the exchange with a faint smile. As the woman left, he stood and approached the counter. "Son," he said to the waiter, his tone kind but firm, "it's not weakness to admit when you've been wrong. It's strength." The waiter's shoulders slumped slightly and he nodded, his earlier arrogance now replaced by a quiet humility. "I messed up," he admitted, his voice low. "I shouldn't have treated him, or anyone, that way." The elderly man nodded approvingly. "That's a good start." Meanwhile, outside the cafe, Keanu walked leisurely down the street. He paused at a flower stand, picking up a small bouquet of daisies. The vendor, an older woman with a warm smile, wrapped them carefully. "For someone special?" she asked. Keanu chuckled softly. "For someone who could use a little brightness." As he continued down the bustling city streets, the bouquet in hand, he passed by a group of school children laughing and playing on the sidewalk. One of them stumbled, dropping their backpack. Without hesitation, Keanu bent down, picked it up, and handed it back to the child with a kind smile. "Here you go." "Thanks, mister." The child beamed before running back to join their friends. Keanu's actions, though small, carried the same energy as they had in the cafe. Effortless kindness that left a mark on those around him. He wasn't looking for recognition or validation. He simply acted as he always did, with quiet integrity. Back inside Lumiere Café, the waiter stood at the counter, replaying the events in his mind. The weight of his actions and Keanu's unexpected response pressed heavily on him. He glanced at the bill Keanu had left, still lying on the counter, its presence almost accusatory. He let out a deep sigh and turned to the elderly man, who was still sipping his espresso. "I don't think I've ever felt so ashamed of myself," the waiter admitted, his voice low but genuine. The elderly man raised an eyebrow, his expression softening. "That's a good sign," he said. "Shame means you're learning. Now, the question is, what will you do about it?" The waiter thought for a moment before straightening his posture. "I'll make it right," he said with quiet determination. "I don't know how yet, but I'll start by being better." The elderly man smiled approvingly. That's all anyone can ask for. As the afternoon passed, the waiter found opportunities to practice what he had just promised. When a harried mother entered the cafe with a crying toddler, he went out of his way to make her order smooth and pleasant, offering the child a small, complimentary treat. When a nervous young man stumbled over his words while ordering, the waiter responded with patience and encouragement. Each act of kindness was small, but it began to chip away at the image of the arrogant, mocking figure he had been earlier. Slowly, the other staff noticed his shift in attitude, and it began to rub off on them too. The cafe, once filled with quiet judgment, now felt warmer, friendlier, a place where even the simplest order of tea could be welcomed with grace. Outside the cafe, Keanu continued his unhurried stroll through the city, the bouquet of daisies still in hand. He stopped at a park bench, sitting quietly as the world bustled around him. A young journalist, out on an assignment, recognized him and hesitated before approaching. "Mr. Reeves?" she asked tentatively. Keanu looked up, offering a small smile. "Yes? I'm sorry to bother you," she said quickly, "but I couldn't help noticing what happened at Lumiere Café earlier. The way you handled that, it was inspiring." Keanu chuckled softly. "Just a cup of tea," he said modestly. The journalist shook her head. "It was more than that. You turned something small into something meaningful. Would you mind if I wrote about it?" Keanu paused, considering her request. "You can write about the message," he said, his tone thoughtful. "But leave me out of it. Focus on kindness. It's not about who does it. It's about the difference it makes." The journalist nodded, understanding. "Thank you. I think people need to hear stories like this." As she left, Keanu leaned back on the bench, his eyes following a small group of children feeding ducks at the nearby pond. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he thought about how one simple act could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he might never see. A week later, Lumiere Café was nearly unrecognizable, not in appearance but in atmosphere. The subtle judgment and elitism that had once defined the place had softened, replaced by a genuine warmth that surprised even the regulars. The waiter, who had been the center of the earlier incident, was now one of the most courteous staff members. He greeted every customer with a smile, whether they ordered the cafe's most extravagant dish or something as simple as tea. Patrons began to notice and appreciate the change. One afternoon, the young woman who had spoken up in defense of Keanu returned to the cafe. She ordered her usual coffee and sat by the window, observing the staff with a faint smile. When the same waiter approached her table to deliver her order, she couldn't resist commenting. "You've changed," she said, her tone teasing but kind. "In a good way." The waiter smiled sheepishly. "Yeah, I guess I have. That guy, Keanu, he really made me think about how I treat people. It wasn't just about him. It was about everyone." The young woman nodded. "He has that effect. But the important thing is, you chose to change. That's on you." The waiter straightened slightly, her words bolstering his resolve. "Thanks," he said. "I'm trying." Word about the cafe's shift in attitude spread through the community. Customers who had once felt out of place now found it welcoming, and those who came for the exclusivity began to appreciate the genuine kindness they encountered. The staff adopted a new motto: "Every order deserves respect." Months later, Keanu sat in a different cafe, enjoying another quiet cup of tea. The room was modest, filled with the hum of casual conversations and the occasional clatter of dishes. He blended in effortlessly, just another patron savoring a simple moment of peace. Unbeknownst to him, the story of his experience at Lumiere Café had taken on a life of its own. The journalist who had witnessed the event had written a heartfelt piece titled "Kindness Over Tea," which had gone viral. Though Keanu's name was left out as he requested, the message resonated deeply with readers worldwide. The article inspired similar acts of kindness in cafes, restaurants, and workplaces across the globe. Social media lit up with stories of people choosing to be more thoughtful in their interactions. One user posted, "This story reminded me to always treat others with respect, no matter how small the moment might seem. You never know who you're inspiring." Back at Lumiere Café, the waiter had become a quiet champion of the values Keanu had exemplified that day. He often shared the story with new staff, emphasizing the lesson he had learned. It wasn't about the tea, he would say. It was about respect for everyone, no matter who they are. Keanu, unaware of the lasting impact of that single interaction, finished his tea and placed his payment on the counter with a generous tip. As he stepped back into the busy city streets, he carried the same quiet grace that had sparked a transformation in one small cafe, and, unknowingly, beyond. This story reminds us that kindness has the power to ripple far beyond the moment. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a small act of kindness that made a big impact? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring tales.